Good evening, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. Average Folks in the Afterlife, number something another. And Frederick Sculthorp, Discussion and Reading, Part 4. Excursions to the Spirit World, 1961. My guide advised me through a medium not to try astral travelling on my own, that is, without the cooperation of my spirit friends. This advice is well founded. Several times I fully expected a projection, having sensed the signs of preparation, and then the idea would be abandoned. On one occasion I had reached the state of projection, but when my spirit body was detached there seemed to be some lingering doubt about it, and I drifted through my bedroom door. Then I went downstairs into my shop and stood behind the counter. The vibrations were low and miserable, and the conditions like twilight. I had not had this experience before, and I wondered if I'd spoilt the process. Suddenly I seemed to be struck by a whole host of vicious and vengeful thoughts. The effect of these cannot be described in words, as they can only be felt in their fullness by the spirit body, but they were sickening and searing. I sensed the direction of their source and saw a group of people standing about 20 yards away in a lurid and dirty orange glow. That doesn't sound good, does it? Some had sneering grins on their faces, others absolute downright hate, and when they knew I had seen them, they altered their line of thought. I saw skulls, mouldering bundles of bones and graves, all mixed up with the thoughts of ghosts, ghouls, vampires, and all things connected with the earthly ignorance and fiction of the unknown. And do you wonder where all those gruesome horror movies about decaying dead people come from? Yes, you got it right. The writers and directors visit those places when they're out of body at night, asleep, and they come back with partial visions, and then they write their strange little films. And that's basically how it happens. Or they pick it up from someone else who's done the same thing and written a book about it. Being a part-time wraith myself, I thought all this was just ridiculous, and at once the thoughts stopped as if a tap had been turned off and the group disappeared. I stopped by the counter a little longer, but did not like the hatred in the thought I had received, and went back to my physical body. I haven't had experiences exactly like that, but I've certainly had experiences that were so profoundly distasteful that I came back to the body. And I thought, oh, I'm not ready for this. Especially in the early days, when I wasn't quite as strong as I am now. So if you have those, don't worry about them. Just abandon it for the night and get back to it some other time. It's not a huge deal. Back in bed, I sensed that these vengeful ones were the rebels or gangsters of spirit. They knew where they were, and they had been there for ages and would probably continue until the futility of their state dawned upon them. It would be particularly hard for a member of a group like this to progress individually, as the hatred of the rest would be powerful. Oh yeah, you don't want to hang out with a crowd like that if you're trying to go places. You really don't. I was rather struck by the old-fashioned ideas of hauntings that this group directed toward me. They seemed to be well rehearsed and included all the popular ideas that ignorant earthwriters had used for generations when writing ghost stories. Ignorant ideas passed down for ages can become ingrained in people's minds, and fear of the unknown is not the least of them. Choosing darkness and a suitable place on earth, a group of low spirits like this could affect a person with latent psychic powers, as their combined thoughts are very strong, and all the best haunting effects can be used. This, together with the person's ingrained fear, would result in the cold, stark terror that is said to be experienced. This gang was the only one of the minor ones that are in the lower astral planes, and there are others with much more powerful methods of attack. Soon after my spirit helpers had warned me against trying astral travel unaccompanied, I was surrounded by such a group whose thoughts were able to benumb my spirit body as if by an electric current, and I was helpless until my helpers intervened. I thought that some of my attackers were boys until I noticed their faces and saw that they were shriveled men. Such stunted spirit bodies are the results of the low mentality. The chief one was of normal size and with a long purplish face with deep cracks in it. Another spirit effect, and I had the impression that he was a businessman during Earth life. I was suddenly plucked from the middle of this gang as if by a gigantic hand, and as I left them I was beset by a whole crowd. A struggling mass, we moved quickly, and, my numbness gone, I am afraid that I became rather vicious, for, as an arm wrapped itself around my face, I bit it rather hard. It was like biting rubber. This struggling bunch, with myself in the middle, was travelling like a ball on an elastic cord, and when we hit my physical body there was a flash like an electrical explosion, and I saw them flung in all directions as if from a shell burst. I was frightened but relieved and had the impression that my life force was strengthened by the sudden reuniting of my two bodies and formed a better protective or repellent zone around me. I give another example of this productive zone around the spirit body when relating an accident in the beyond. My thoughts on this experience were interrupted by a movement on the ceiling which took the form of a huge bronze shield, looking immensely strong and solid. This symbol in particular instance was just as welcome as the beautiful ones were in theirs. Sitting up in bed with the light on, I wondered if I was really scared, but thinking of the shield I had seen, I considered the experience to be just one more of my spirit lessons. These low entities were very powerful when working in a group on their own wavelength and have learnt many things. When I was plucked from their midst, it seemed instantaneous, yet they were able to project themselves and hang on to me. No doubt my anger and fighting mad frame of mind caused my astral cord to pull me back to my physical body at tremendous speed. The phenomenon of the electrical flash or explosion was curious and may have been caused by the entities coming in sudden contact with a higher potential, which would cause their natural rebound. That phrase about my anger and fighting mad frame of mind, with lower astral entities, sometimes, not always, you have to develop that attitude if they're aggressive. You may have underestimated them and thought they were people you could debate and argue with, and then if they get onto you and start pummeling you, even though they can't really hurt you, energetically they can do damage. You'll need that fighting mad frame of mind. You need to be toughened for that lower astral stuff. And basically your spirit helpers won't let you do it until you're toughened up, until you've got those shields and those helpers with you. And you'll only get what you can handle. But if you prove yourself on, minor skirmishes, they'll move you up the ladder for sure. Up the ladder in the downward sense, not upwards to heaven, but lower into the not so nice places. But you'll only get what you can handle. I once projected from an armchair during the day and was taken to a none too bright state, but did not get full consciousness. I was, in fact, like one on the plane of illusion. I still thought I was on Earth. I walked for a considerable time and arrived at a sort of wide courtyard between some houses. I felt lost, and seeing a man enter a house, I ran over and followed him in to ask what district it was. As I began to speak, he suddenly turned and stared at me like a person on Earth, seeing an apparition, and his legs nearly gave way. This was probably because of my unformed, ghost-like appearance. Then, giving a mirthless laugh, he managed to gasp, "You startled me." Seeing his condition and to save further embarrassment, I left the house. Outside, it began to dawn on me that I might be out of body, and I carefully looked at the surroundings, but of course that was no help, as I knew they would be the same as on Earth. Then I remembered the spirit Earth was dry and grainy and could be made to trickle through the fingers like sand. I bent down to take a handful, but there was no loose earth, for the courtyard was paved. However, the act of touching these stones brought instant consciousness, and I became more in tune with the wavelength, and I straightened up expectantly, looking forward to new spirit experiences. But I had hardly gone a few paces when the clutter of a kitchen utensil in the adjoining room at home brought me back to my armchair. I looked at the clock and saw that I had been out for an hour and a half, which would seem to agree with my walk in spirit. It appears rather pointless to have only a few moments of full consciousness in spirit in an hour and a half, but I have realized for a long time now that in projection, as in clairvoyance or in seance, every attempt is an experiment, and there can be no guaranteed results. We are helped by our spirit friends in all ways, but in the end, personal awareness, that they cannot provide. That must come from within. Those who have studied many spirit books and books on spirit life will have read that the boundaries of a plane appear sometimes as a mountain range, and that sometimes a lower state may be reached through a hole in the ground. I have seen both of these, as have I, and the latter is very strange. In the first case, which was about 1938, yikes, that's 80 years ago, I had been taken to an airfield in spirit. The airmen were the usual type of young servicemen and full of fun. They were teasing a young pilot who was determined to fly over a nearby range of mountains. Apparently the others had tried it and failed. He entered a plane and flew off, and we watched him steadily climb the steep side of the mountain, but just before reaching the top he lost speed and had to turn. He tried it again and again, but had to return and endure more laughter from his companions. I inspected the planes. They did not appear to be aesthetic replicas of earthly planes, but spirit-made, as the propellers were not large enough for Earth use. In the second case, I had met a soldier in spirit whom I knew in the 1914 war, and had persuaded him to come with me to a much better locality. We had been walking for a while, and the country was improving when he suddenly broke away and ran back. I ran after him, but he seemed frantic and reached a sort of pit in the ground and jumped down it. The hole was about 5 yards across. I felt upset over this, as I had known him for some time in the army. Some writers, when describing the spheres, say that they encircle the earth in layers, like the skin of an onion, and this incident seemed to offer some corroboration of this idea, at least for the lower planes. Here's a comparison here. Charles Drayton Thomas, in his book Life Beyond Death with Evidence, I think that came out in the 1930s. I've got a copy, but I'd have to look. Writes of a conversation he had with his father through the mediumship of Miss Osborne Leonard. His father mentioned those pits, which he called tunnels in the ground for convenience in passing from one sphere to another. I also have had experiences with conditions where two different states or wavelengths interpenetrate and each is invisible to the other, as in the following example. In my early projections, my visits to the astral office to await orders for my next lesson in the lower states became so frequent that I began to get weary of the place and its vibrations. Then came an occasion when I was taken there and once more became conscious of it. Mentally I murmured, "What, this place again?" Immediately there was a transformation, and I saw the dull locality fade and found myself standing in a sunny countryside with pleasant vibrations. It was quite remarkable. I seemed to be enveloped by the greater power of my guide, and my vibrations raised to those of the better place. Yet I did not move from the spot. My teachers now evidently thought I had had my fill of this astral depot, for I never saw it again, although I was still occasionally taken to the lower spheres. During my early projections, I was rather impressed by my ability to sense characters in a lesson duly followed. I had been taken to a rather dull state, and a man passed me a little way off. He had a cheerful grin and waved a greeting to me, and I waved back at him, whereupon he came over to me, followed by a woman. He said, "You wanted to see her about something?" I thought for a bit and could not recollect any previous meeting, and so shook my head. But he persisted again, and I tried to pick up some idea of what he meant and of his thoughts. And I finally said, "No, I am sorry, I've never seen her before." The man shrugged his shoulders, and the pair went away. I was mystified about this until my spirit helper told me that the man was a white slaver who on earth used to live on the immortal earnings of his companion. They were old hands in spirit and had learnt to suppress their thoughts, at least to me, a student of spirit conditions. So you can see there how that unbalanced relationship continued on into the afterlife. I've got a meditation in one of my blogs where I go to various places, and one of the places I go is sort of a large mansion type house where someone who was a big cheese in one of those South or Central American dictatorships and bullied people with his power. And I'm not saying he was the president or the prime minister. He may have just been a general. In fact, he probably was. And could have been Colombia, could have been Nicaragua. I'm not sure. It didn't really matter. And I'd visited a few times and debated with him, and he was still kind of making plans about, power takeovers and this, that, and the other. And the people that worked in the house, some servants and whatnot, were still afraid of him. Except one woman who seemed to have, since my previous visit, plucked up the courage, and I think I kind of bring her and walk her out, and because my presence gave her the sort of the presence to go against him, and similar situation. People in the lower astrals often carry through their fear and dependency on authority figures, whether they be politicians or soldiers or ministers, priests, whatnot. And they need to have their courage pumped up in order to break free. Yeah, that's basically it. Don't ask me which blog name it was. I can't remember, but I do remember the incident. Apart from the lower dull states, there are a number of spheres of normal brightness, earth-like in a better way, where the spirits enjoy themselves, getting accustomed to the many possibilities of the spirit world. It is difficult to describe these easygoing states, as they are neither backward nor advanced. Generally speaking, all spirits keep to a habit of thought or ways of living for a time, as during earth life. The countryman prefers open spaces, and the townsman the built-up areas. Some towns I saw were crowded, especially where there's a shopping centre, as on earth. I remember years ago, before I really did conscious travel, reading in a book by a medium about shopping centres on the astral plane. And it shocked me at first, and then the communication continued about, you don't think people could come here without wanting that habit fulfilled, And I thought, yeah, that's right. People spend lots of time in shopping malls. They'd want them there too. So a lot of the stuff's fairly obvious, really, when you think about it. Generally speaking, all spirits keep to a habit of thought or ways of living for a time during earth life. Some towns I saw were crowded, especially where there was a shopping centre on earth. There is also traffic on the roads, but in this particular state it consisted mainly of those who were road-minded on earth. Once I found it interesting and rather funny, like other onlookers, to watch this passing show of traffic. Among the usual cars there were quite a number that were evidently the result of enthusiastic do-it-yourself builders. As any whim can be exploited to the full without the earthly expense and trouble, there were some strange-looking 3- and 4-wheelers on the road, and all of them went as though they were expected to do in spirit. I saw one man riding a bicycle who was dressed in a Norfolk jacket and knickerbockers of about the 1906 period. There was, I think there was somebody in one of the scenes in my first book, Eternal Life and How to Enjoy It. Somebody goes by, a lady goes by, a bit kind of Mary Poppins-like, on a lady's bicycle with, she's wearing a long skirt and a blouse, I think, and her hair back in a bun and stuff. And there's a basket with food items, picnic items in it. I'm almost certain there's something in there about that, but it's a long while since I read that book. But I mean, that's exactly what I saw on one occasion, and or was it? No, it was either what I saw or what my guide Henry saw, and then told me about. One or the other. But people like to be, they've got the freedom to be as eccentric as they want. So lots of people do that. It's not uncommon. Knickerbockers of about the 1906 period. He had constructed seats like outriggers on either side of his saddle, which were carrying children. I could imagine that perpetual motion inventors had a wonderful time here, as all their ideas would probably be very successful. I had never noticed any bodily tiredness when in spirit, but certain things cause a mental weariness, and so that one needs a change of thought. I once went on a long motor coach ride on a great wide motorway. We went a great distance, and when we were coming back, I began to get mentally tired through watching the changing scenery. I remember some of the places we had passed on the outward journey, and when coming back, I knew how far we had to go, and it seemed interminable. I believe I was taken on this trip to experience this effect on the mentality. There are so many different varieties of house in this state. Some people like to keep to the style that they had on earth, and even have unnecessary things as it is their idea of home, while others, knowing the possibilities, would have something entirely new. Relatives and friends who have reached this state begin to contact each other, and as can be imagined, there can be quite a wide circle of acquaintances. True. Parties are formed which make a round of visits to the home of others, and recently I was with such a party. There were about 12 of us, and it was conducted by a lady who years ago was a friend of my family, a motherly soul who was also fond of visiting during her earth life. Habits, habits, habits. Walking on either side to meet were my brother and brother-in-law, who have passed over. And when we reached the first house, I saw it was of the ultra-modern style, with long, wide windows, and the upper and outer walls boarded, like a barn, as some district councillors have said. When we were inside, I decided to stay and look over the place, and the rest of the party went on. After a while, I noticed another party approaching who looked curious, as they had seen me through the wide windows. When they entered, one of them said, "Hello, what are you doing here?" I replied, "I came with Ada May's party, but they have gone on, and I am still looking around. But what are you doing here?" There was a general laugh over this and some whispering among the ladies, and I heard one say, "Yes, I can see the likeness." I then sensed that they had placed me through their contact with my relatives, and they smiled and left the place. It is interesting to note that in giving the name of this old friend, Ada May, I easily remembered the name Ada, but there was a slight pause before I could draw the memory of the surname to my mentality. Spirits returning to earth and communicating through a medium also have this strange loss of memory, and sometimes cannot recall their own surnames, as they are also out of their natural sphere. Perhaps as a part of the life force remains with the physical body during projection, so might part of the memory. I was once taken to a place that seemed to be a combined exhibition and surplus goods store. It was housed in several large halls and had a strange assortment of things, from ship's lamps and locomotive funnels to kitchen gadgets like food mixers, etc. Many of the things were on counters which people were examining, and stacked against the walls were tall things like lampposts and ladders. The end hall contained a boat show and had an assortment of small sailing boats, canoes, and launches. In the middle of the hall there was a showpiece, a sailing boat as big as a Thames barge, and with the sails set. It had the graceful lines and was without decks, and I had the impression of lightness and speed. There was a notice board in front of it describing it as a one-time smuggler's boat and giving the sail plan, which was ingenious. It was cutter-rigged, and although the large mainsail looked conventional, it was in fact of double canvas, and in the event of pursuit could be opened like a book and boomed out with great advantage if running before the wind. Looking up at the sails, I noticed that some humorist had painted the name the Jolly Roger on it. And since I tried to find some record of this particular ruse, but none have been successful. The end of the hall was open and there was a slope going back down the river, and I saw several boats being tried out. Back in the hall, I was in the corner looking at some small boat fittings when the light suddenly went dim. I was particularly interested in something, and forgetting where I was, I put my hand in my pocket for a box of matches when everything became light again. The dimness was a waning of spirit power, as seconds later I was drawn back to the physical body. Yes, spirit power does seem to wane after a while. I've not really tracked it carefully, but it comes and goes, as do many other things in life. In one of my early projections, I went for a long country walk with my wife. It was a happy occasion for both of us and quite earth-like, for we went a considerable distance. Then later, the earthly thoughts came to me that it would be nice to have a cup of tea, but I did not mention it to my wife. Soon I thought she was directing our steps to a tea garden, a large arbour covered with roses. Sounds nice. As we entered it, I noticed, inquisitive me, that the roses were also blooming under the arbour, and remembered that they did not bloom like this under the rose arch in my garden on earth. Sitting down at a table, I noticed there was another couple nearby. We waited a bit, and then suddenly, as if clairvoyantly, I saw a cup of tea before my eyes. This quickly went, and at once I felt refreshed. The illusion was perfect. My taste and feeling were exactly as if I had indeed drained a cup. At this time I thought I had found out the way that nourishment was taken in spirits. But I was wrong. It was simply my spirit helper's way of satisfying my desire for tea, and so completing my day out with my wife. Isn't that sweet? Although my spirit body is sensitive to the thoughts and vibrations of a plane, there are some things that do not register. I once tasted some mayonnaise, but to me it had no more flavour than chalk and water. And when walking with my daughter, we passed a drinking fountain and I went over to have a look at it. Beside it was a glass containing cubes of ice, and when I touched these, there was no coolness whatsoever. Probably one has to belong to a sphere to experience all the sensations of it. I have not seen any ordinary food eaten in this particular state, but the earthly habit of a chat over a cup of tea is still popular. It is a mental relaxation, and I had one with my wife. Once I suddenly became conscious out of the body and found that I was walking with my wife. We had 2 children with us, both about 3 years of age, and being cared for by my wife. We were just leaving an exhibition which appeared to be something like the Ideal Home exhibition we have in London, and looking regretfully back, I saw that it looked bright and interesting and felt sorry that I had missed it all. I have mentioned earlier that my spirit helpers do not always know what experiences are retained in my earthly consciousness, and it appears that this subtle wavelength may or may not be in action at the time. In this particular experience, I believe my wife had thought that I had seen the whole of the exhibition, and so it appears that the finer spirit body can carry on quite normally, whether the earthly consciousness is there or not. Important point that. The finer body, the finer spirit body can continue on quite normally, whether the earthly consciousness is there or not. Sensing my wife's intentions, I knew that we were making for some tea rooms, so I asked her, couldn't we have tea inside? And she replied, oh, they would be much too crowded. However, we entered the tea rooms and were seated at a table when I noticed that one of our children had seated herself next to a tiny child on the next table. The tiny child began to get very playful, as some will when there is a table to bang on with their hands, and was striking out in all directions. I thought it best that our child sat next to me. I had no sooner thought this when the child got up and sat with me. I was surprised, and certainly it seemed to be the result of telepathic thought. This would greatly simplify child rearing, as the minds would be plastic and receptive. When we left the tea rooms, my wife took me to a house where there was a fine tapestry on the wall of a room. I felt its texture, which was like silk, and my wife remarked, "This is rather special." He had some difficulty in getting it. I did not sense what the difficulty was, and as the owner was looking on, I did not like to ask. Oh, that proper English attitude, I tell you. On the sideboard there were some vases of beautiful flowers which had delicate tints of pink and blue. I did not recognize them, but they looked like daffodils partly split open, and the centers were tipped with gold and glittered as if they were actually of that metal. Not long after I started astral projection and meeting my wife in spirit, we were once walking through a park. Some little way ahead of us, there were two women also walking, and I began to realize that they were talking about us. Then one finished the conversation by saying, "Oh yes, she is looking after her husband and two children on earth." These women did not know that to talk and think about a person in spirit also sends a telepathic message to that person. As mentioned above, it is difficult when out of the body to recall place names and proper names. I have a daughter living in Gloucester, and I often go by road from London to visit her. When once talking to my wife in the spirit world, we paused to watch a man go by in a small carriage pulled by four tiny ponies. I turned to my wife and was going to say, "It would take me a long time to go to Gloucester like that," when I could not remember the name Gloucester. Quickly, I visualized a spot on the map to the west of England, hoping this would help me to recall the name. But it was not necessary, as my wife had received everything I wanted to convey, and our talk continued normally. A conversation in spirit is a wonderful thing. The interplay of minds can exchange a wealth of meaning that no choice of words can give. Well, I don't know about that. It just means they're better at telepathic thought than verbal expression. It is natural and automatic, and it is only later that one realizes how few words are actually spoken. To say that one thing and mean another in spirit would need some clever mental gymnastics. Once when becoming conscious in spirit, I found myself sitting on a chair in the middle of a party, and seated in front of me was a pretty child of about 3 years of age. As I was talking to the child, I suddenly felt a pair of arms placed around my neck from behind. At once I knew it was my wife, and also the kind of dress she was wearing. When I turned, I found that my sensing was correct. The dress was not an expected thought of mine, as I have seen her in spirit in other dresses. Consistently vivid experiences. Frederick had, although maybe separated by years and slotted into a diary from time to time. And I'm sure a lot of the more successful ones he's not even talking about. And maybe some really transcendental ones he feels like the audience wouldn't be ready for. But, we'll see. Moving somebody up a level, and that guy that was running away from him and diving down the hole. The lead singer of the famous British rock group of the 60s, the Yardbirds, Keith Ralph, I once found him in a fairly, not a lower astral realm, not a hell realm, but a place where a lower realm, earth-like of course, where a lot of stuff didn't work. And he was a musician through and through. He was a singer, he was a composer, he was a guitarist, he played mouth harp. In later bands, he played more guitar than he ever did with the Yardbirds, because they had all their famous guitarists. But anyway, I found him, because I went looking for him, and he'd been dead for quite a while, which is curious to see. He died, got electrocuted with a bad connection to his amplifier. And he was, had a weakened heart and one lung and stuff, so it didn't take much to knock him off, even though he was only about 40 years old. This might be in the 90s or the 80s sometime. And Anyway, he was frustrated with his musicianship on this lower level because the electricity supply was wonky, to say the best, the least, or whatever. And so I knew to move him, about this thing where Frederick talks about you raise the vibration a little and you move from this gloomy, depressing, world area up to a more lighted, radiant, pleasant area. And it just sort of happens. I knew to move people up to higher level. I mean, I talked to Keith Rothenberg. I said, I can take you to a place where this shit doesn't happen. And he was frustrated, and because I don't know, writing a song or playing with other people, I can't quite remember. But he was kind of like, okay, show me. And I said, okay. And, I got him to close his eyes and everyone else that was around. And I moved them all up 1 or 2 levels to, not a fabulous area of the astral plane, but an okay plane where the thought of electricity translated into the expectation of power, which translated into things working. So his guitar and his amp actually started to work. I didn't spend a lot of time with him. I told him briefly what I was up to, and I doubt that he remembers now, but you never know. But you do move people up through the levels, that's for sure. You can do it. And they're there, and you just have to, get their full confidence that you're leading them to a place that they actually want to be in. And Keith Rolfe certainly wanted to be in a better place, no question about that. Anyway, that's enough for part 4, and we'll hopefully get to part 5 tomorrow night. We're really whistling through this one, I tell you. So, keep those cards and letters coming on in there, and ask any questions you feel like. And au revoir, mes enfants.